The rancher thought he would die in loneliness, until 4 Apache widows called him husband. John Miller had always been a man of the land. From the time he was a boy, he had learned to rise with the sun, to feel the rhythm of the seasons, and to read the subtle signs of life on the ranch. The Arizona desert had been his classroom, his playground, and eventually his home. He knew every rock, every scrubby bush, every hollow where water might gather after a rare rain. The cattle knew him too, as if his presence was part of the earth itself. But in the years after his wife's death, all of that knowledge, all of that experience could not fill the empty space in his heart. He had loved her deeply. Martha had been the heart of his life, soft-spoken but full of strength. Together, they had built the ranch into something steady and strong. But when she passed, the world felt like it had tilted on its axis. The quiet of the house became deafening. The laughter that once echoed through the rooms was replaced by a silence so thick it pressed against him like the heat of the desert sun. At first, John tried to keep going as he always had. He woke before dawn, fed the cattle, checked the fences, and tended to the fields. But every task reminded him of what he had lost. When he opened the old wooden gate, he half expected to see Martha leaning against it, her smile soft and welcoming. When he milked the cows or fed the chickens, he reached for the sound of her voice, only to be met with silence. Even the wind seemed to whisper her name, taunting him with memories he could not touch. The ranch, once a place of life and growth, became a prison of routine. John stopped going into town except when necessary. He avoided the post office, the market, and the church. He even turned down invitations from neighbors, politely but firmly, because the idea of social interaction felt like stepping into a world that no longer belonged to him. He told himself it was better this way. Solitude was safe. Solitude was predictable. And yet there were nights when the loneliness gnawed at him so sharply he could not sleep. He spent those nights on the porch of his small wooden house, a glass of water in hand, staring up at the stars. The desert sky was vast and endless, and John found a strange comfort in that. The stars did not demand anything of him. They did not ask him to smile or speak. They simply existed, steady and distant. He would imagine Martha's hand in his, her fingers intertwined with his. He would remember the way she laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones, and the way her eyes would crinkle with warmth. But when he reached for those memories, they slipped through his mind like sand through fingers. John's beard grew long and gray, and his hair, once thick and black, turned silver in the harsh sun. His hands, strong from decades of work, became rougher, but they also trembled more often when he thought about the future, or the lack of it. He stopped caring much about appearances, wearing the same dusty shirt and worn-out jeans day after day. The ranch, once bustling with life, now felt like an extension of his grief. Empty barns, quiet fields, and a wind-swept corral became his companions. Even the dogs he had once raised seemed to sense his sorrow, staying close but silent, as if respecting his space. Some days John would wander across the property, checking fences or inspecting the water troughs, talking to himself more than the animals. He called himself a fool, a stubborn old man, a relic of a world that had passed him by. And yet, he could not bring himself to leave. The land had a grip on him stronger than any human connection. It reminded him of who he was, even when it reminded him of what he had lost. In town, people whispered about John. They said he had shut himself off from the world, that he was too proud or too broken to seek companionship again. They did not understand that John's isolation was not about pride. It was about fear. Fear of loss, fear of opening his heart and being heard again, fear that no one could ever fit into the life he had built. a life that was half empty already. Winter brought its own trials. The cold nights were long and bitter, and John often woke shivering under his thin blanket. The wind would howl across the plains, rattling the old windows and pushing the icy air into the corners of the house. Sometimes he would light the fireplace and sit for hours, staring at the flames, imagining Martha's face flickering in the glow. He would remember the mornings they had shared over coffee, the quiet afternoons reading side by side, and the gentle way she had called his name. The fire would die down, the room would grow dark, and John would sit alone, wishing for a warmth that could not be rekindled. Spring brought a different kind of loneliness. The land would awaken, flowers blooming, the cattle giving birth, birds returning from migration, and John felt like a visitor in a world full of life he could no longer fully enjoy. The air smelled of fresh earth and rain, and yet he could not shake the feeling that he was separate from it all, an invisible observer in a vibrant scene. The laughter of children in town, the chatter of neighbors repairing their fences or tending gardens, it all reminded him of the life he had walked away from, and he recoiled from it like a man burned by memory. Despite everything, John still worked. The ranch demanded attention, and work was all that kept the loneliness from consuming him entirely. He repaired fences that sagged under the weight of winter, tended to sick cows, and harvested hay under the scorching sun. These tasks were his only connection to purpose, a way to remind himself that life went on, even when his own heart refused to. He felt the land was forgiving in a way people were not. It accepted him as he was, tired, sorrowful, and unyielding. And yet, deep down, there was a faint stirring of longing. John did not realize it at first. It began as a subtle ache, a quiet whisper that he could not ignore. Even when he tried, he would find himself imagining the sound of voices other than his own, the warmth of human touch, the comfort of shared work, or even just the presence of someone who cared. He pushed the thoughts away, telling himself that hope was dangerous, that attachment meant inevitable pain. But the desert night was long, and the heart has ways of remembering what the mind wishes to forget. In those moments, John remembered what it was like to be part of a family, to share responsibilities and joys with another person. He remembered Martha's gentle guidance, her laughter echoing across the fields, and the small moments of connection that had once filled his days with meaning. He remembered the smell of her hair, the way her eyes sparkled when she was happy, and the quiet understanding that existed between two people who had built a life together. Those memories were painful, but they were also a reminder that he was capable of love, capable of companionship, even if he had forgotten how. And so, John Miller continued his days in solitude, tending to the ranch, watching the seasons change, and listening to the silence that had become his companion. He was a man marked by loss, shaped by grief, and defined by the land that had been both his refuge and his prison. Yet somewhere deep in the quiet of his heart, a small ember of hope remained, a fragile thought that perhaps one day his life could change in ways he could not yet imagine. Until then, he would keep going, tending to the cattle, repairing the fences, and facing each day alone, with only the vast desert sky and the memory of a love lost to guide him through the long nights. The morning sun rose pale and golden over John Miller's ranch, washing the desert in a soft light that made the sand and scrubby bushes shimmer like a quiet promise. John was already outside, inspecting the fence near the northern pasture. His hands were rough from work, and his skin had been tanned and cracked by decades under the desert sun. He squinted at the horizon as he always did, scanning for trouble among the cattle, the fences, or the sudden, unpredictable desert storms. But that morning, the horizon held something unusual. 4 figures were moving slowly along the dirt track that led to his ranch. At first, John thought they were travelers passing through, but as they drew closer, he realized they were 4 women. Their clothing was simple, patched in places, and their hair was long and dark, tied back with pieces of cloth. They carried small bundles and pots, and their eyes held a quiet determination tinged with weariness. John straightened and called out, his voice echoing across the plain. "Hello there, you lost?" The women stopped and exchanged glances. One of them, the eldest, stepped forward. Her face was lined with experience and sorrow, but her eyes were sharp and steady. "We are seeking work," she said softly, her voice calm but firm. "We have traveled far, and we need shelter for a time." John felt a strange hesitation. He had lived alone for so long that the presence of others felt foreign, almost threatening. His first instinct was to tell them to move along. Travelers often caused problems. They could be trouble. But something in the way they carried themselves, the quiet dignity in their voices, made him pause. They were not beggars, not criminals, not careless wanderers. They were women who had survived hardship and needed a safe place to rest. "All right," he said finally, his voice rough. "You can stay in the barn for now. But I don't have much food, and I don't have room in the house." The women nodded, as if they had expected nothing more. They followed him silently as he led the way to the old wooden barn, which had once housed his horses and stored hay. The barn smelled of straw and dust, but it was solid and dry. John gestured to the space, indicating that they could set up their things there. "This will have to do," he said. "You can rest here, but I'll expect you to work while you're here." "This is a working ranch, not an inn." The eldest woman nodded again. "We understand." "We can help," she said. "We are strong, and we have skills. We can work for our keep." John watched them settle in. One woman unpacked a small pot and began arranging it neatly on a wooden shelf. Another tended to a corner, sweeping the floor carefully. The third unrolled a bundle of cloth, folding it with precision, while the fourth sat quietly, observing the barn and the ranch as if she were already planning the day ahead. Their movements were careful, deliberate, and full of purpose. It was clear that they were used to hard work, used to surviving through challenges. Over the next few days, John began to see the value of their presence. The women rose early with him, helping him feed the cattle, mend broken fences, and check the water troughs. They moved with quiet efficiency, and though John was reserved, he began to feel the relief of having capable hands around him. Tasks that had taken him hours now took half the time, and the ranch began to feel alive again, even if only slightly. John noticed small things about them. Thou. The eldest, whom he came to know as Clara, was thoughtful and wise. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried meaning. The second woman, Lila, had a gentle touch with animals, speaking softly to the horses and cows in a way that seemed to calm them instantly. The third, May, was practical and resourceful, fixing broken tools and making the old barn more comfortable. The youngest, Anna, was quiet but keen-eyed, noticing details that even John had overlooked. Together, they formed a rhythm that was steady and dependable, much like the seasons themselves. At first, John kept his distance. He spoke when necessary, gave instructions, and observed their work, but he did not share much of himself. He had spent years building walls around his heart, convinced that no one could truly understand the life he led or the pain he carried. But he could not deny a growing curiosity about these women. They were survivors, and in their own way, they reminded him of Martha, strong, resourceful, and unafraid of hardship. One evening, after a long day of work, John found himself sitting by the fire outside the barn. The women had prepared a simple meal over an open flame: cornmeal, beans, and roasted vegetables. The aroma was comforting, and for the first time in months, John felt a flicker of warmth in his chest. Clara noticed his hesitation and gestured for him to join them. "You should eat with us," she said gently. "You work hard, you need food and company." John hesitated, then nodded. He moved closer, careful to keep a respectful distance. They shared the meal in silence at first, the firelight flickering across their faces, casting shadows that danced along the barn walls. Slowly, conversation began to flow. Lila asked John about his cattle. May offered suggestions for improving irrigation. Anna spoke quietly about the desert plants she had studied on their journey. Even in small ways, a sense of connection began to form. As days turned into weeks, the presence of the women began to change the ranch. Tasks were completed more efficiently, and the air seemed lighter. John realized he no longer felt the oppressive weight of silence pressing down on him. The sound of voices, the laughter that occasionally escaped when one of the women made a small joke or the soft humming of a tune while working, began to fill the space he had thought forever empty. One afternoon, a sudden desert storm swept across the plains. The wind whipped up dust and sand, rattling the barn and making the air almost impossible to breathe. John struggled to secure a gate when he heard the women calling for him. Together they worked through the storm, tying down loose boards, guiding the cattle to shelter, and making sure everything was safe. By the time the storm passed, they were soaked and exhausted, but there was a sense of triumph in the air. For the first time, John felt that he was part of a team, not alone in his struggles. Evenings became a time of quiet reflection. They would gather around the fire, sharing stories of their pasts. John listened more than he spoke, learning about their lives, the husbands they had lost, and the journeys they had undertaken to reach his ranch. He was moved by their resilience and strength, and he found himself opening in small ways, sharing memories of Martha, of the life he had once led, and the grief that had haunted him since her passing. It was during these conversations that the women began to call him husband. Though not in the sense of ownership or ceremony, it was a term of respect and affection, a recognition of his place in their lives, the man who had offered them shelter, work, and protection. John felt a mixture of surprise, discomfort, and warmth. He had never imagined that such a connection could form in his lonely life, and yet he could not deny that their presence had begun to heal a part of him he had thought was beyond repair. The ranch began to thrive in ways John had not expected. Fields were maintained, fences repaired, and the animals were healthier than they had been in years. But beyond the physical improvements, the greatest change was the emotional life that had returned to the property. The barn, once a quiet shelter for straw and tools, was now a place of laughter, conversation, and shared work. The house, too, no longer felt like a tomb of memories. John found himself preparing meals, sharing small jokes, and even allowing himself moments of ease that he had not known in a long time. Yet, despite these positive changes, John still carried caution. He had been hurt before, and the idea of attachment frightened him. He was careful not to let his heart run too far ahead, even as he noticed the warmth growing between him and the women. He watched them, admired their skills, and felt gratitude for their companionship, but he did not yet allow himself to dream of a future that included them fully in his life. And still, the spark of hope that had lain dormant for so long began to glow more brightly. John Miller, once resigned to a life of quiet grief and solitude, began to feel something he had not felt in years: the faint but unmistakable stirrings of connection, trust, and the possibility that life could offer him more than empty days and lonely nights. The desert around him remained vast and unforgiving, but within the barn and the ranch, A new rhythm had emerged. It was a rhythm of work and companionship, of shared responsibility and small joys, of resilience and quiet laughter. The presence of the 4 Apache widows had brought a warmth that John had thought he would never feel again, and though he did not yet know what the future held, he knew one thing with certainty: his life was no longer empty, and the loneliness he had carried for so long had begun to lift. The weeks turned into months, and the rhythm of the ranch settled into a new, comfortable pattern. John Miller woke with the sun, as he had always done, but now he no longer felt the oppressive weight of solitude pressing on him. The presence of Clara, Lila, May, and Anna brought a quiet energy to the ranch, and their work was steady, reliable, and careful. John could not help but notice that the chores he had once done alone felt lighter, almost enjoyable, when shared with others. Morning began with a flurry of activity. John would check the cattle and ensure that the fences were secure, while the women tended to chores that required careful hands. Lila fed the chickens and spoke to them gently, coaxing them with soft words and laughter. May worked on repairing tools and organizing the barn, making small adjustments that improved efficiency. Clara supervised, quietly offering guidance without asserting control, while Anna observed, learning and helping wherever needed. John found that their different strengths complemented one another perfectly, and their teamwork made the ranch more productive than it had been in years. But beyond the work, John noticed other changes. The ranch began to feel alive in ways he had forgotten. The barn, once silent and dusty, now echoed with laughter and conversation. Meals became a shared experience rather than a solitary routine. Even the simple act of sitting around the fire in the evening took on a new warmth. John found himself listening more than he spoke, learning about the past lives of the women, their hopes, their sorrows, and their quiet joys. Each story revealed resilience and determination, qualities that John had admired in Martha, and he found himself drawn to them in ways he had not expected. One afternoon, as the sun hung low over the desert, John and Clara worked together repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by a storm. Sweat dripped from their brows, and the heat made the work slow and tiring, but the companionship made the labor easier. Clara moved with precision, handing him tools and guiding him when needed. John, who had spent years avoiding close contact with anyone, felt a strange comfort in her presence. Her steady voice and calm manner reminded him of home, of a life where he had been loved and understood. "You handled the hammer better than I thought," Clara said with a small smile. John grunted, half embarrassed, half pleased. "And you're surprisingly strong for someone who hasn't lived here all her life?" Their laughter was brief but genuine. Moments like these became more frequent, and John began to notice that his heart, long dormant, was stirring again. He was careful not to dwell on it too much. He had been hurt before, and he knew better than to let hope grow too quickly. Yet he could not deny that the presence of these women had softened something inside him that he had thought was lost forever. Evenings became a time for shared stories and gentle camaraderie. The women would gather around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, and recount tales of their lives before the ranch. Clara spoke of her husband, a gentleman who had taught her the value of patience and hard work. Lila shared memories of raising children, of laughter and tears, and of the strength that came from enduring loss. May described the clever tricks she had used to survive hardships, and Anna, the youngest, listened quietly, occasionally offering insights that showed a wisdom beyond her years. John listened to these stories with rapt attention. He found himself sharing bits of his own life, stories of Martha, and of the years he had spent alone on the ranch. The women did not judge him for his sorrow. They simply listened, nodding and understanding, offering quiet empathy. It was a new kind of connection for John, one built not on words alone, but on shared experience, respect, and mutual care. Over time, the women's presence began to influence other aspects of life on the ranch. Meals became more than simple sustenance. They were moments of shared enjoyment. Lila would prepare a stew with fresh vegetables from the small garden she had started near the barn. May baked bread, using an old recipe she had learned from her mother. Clara taught John to appreciate the simple pleasures in these acts, and Anna began keeping small journals of their daily routines, noting observations and little successes. The ranch, once just a workplace, became a home in the truest sense. Even John's interactions with the animals began to change. He noticed that the cows seemed calmer when the women were around. The horses responded to Clara's gentle guidance, and the chickens followed Lila's soft commands. John realized that their influence extended beyond human relationships. It touched every living thing on the property. There was harmony in the ranch that had been absent for years, a quiet balance born from teamwork, care, and respect. One afternoon, as John worked with Anna to mend a section of the irrigation system, he felt an unusual lightness in his chest. The sun was warm, the air dry but gentle, and Anna laughed at a joke he had made. For the first time in years, John felt a sense of belonging. He was no longer merely surviving. He was part of a community, part of a family that had chosen to build itself here, in the heart of the desert. Even the nights, once so lonely and cold, took on a different quality. They would sit by the fire outside the barn, watching the stars stretch endlessly across the sky. John found himself sharing small stories from his youth, lessons he had learned, and even dreams he had once had but thought impossible. The women listened, offering insights and gentle encouragement. Their presence reminded him that life, even after great loss, could offer unexpected joy and companionship. As the seasons changed, the women began to call John husband more frequently, though not as a formal title. It was a term of respect, recognition, and affection. It was their way of saying that he had earned a place in their lives, not as a ruler or owner, but as a partner, a caretaker, and a source of stability. John felt a mix of emotions, surprise, gratitude, and a quiet warmth that he had thought he would never feel again. He had never imagined that a life so full of grief could evolve into one filled with love and connection. The women also grew closer to one another, forming bonds that mirrored a family. They shared responsibilities without complaint, comforted each other in moments of doubt, and celebrated small victories together. Clara, with her quiet wisdom, often mediated disagreements, guiding the group with patience and fairness. Lila's gentleness provided comfort during difficult days. May's practical skills kept the ranch running smoothly, and Anna's keen observation ensured that nothing went unnoticed. Together they created a dynamic that was stronger than any one individual, and John found himself grateful for their presence every single day. John's own habits began to change. He started rising earlier to join the women in their morning chores, sharing in their work rather than simply supervising. He learned new skills from them, such as careful techniques for planting vegetables and methods for caring for the smaller animals. He also began to enjoy the small rituals of daily life, the aroma of fresh bread in the morning, the sound of laughter echoing across the barn, and the quiet moments of reflection by the fire at night. These moments, small as they were, brought a richness to his days that he had not known in years. One evening, as a cool desert breeze swept through the ranch, John and Clara sat together outside the barn, watching the sun set over the distant mesas. The sky was painted with brilliant shades of orange, pink, and purple, and the world seemed at peace. Clara spoke softly, her voice carrying the wisdom of her experiences. "You have done well, John. You have built more than a ranch here. You have built a home, and you have built trust." John nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. "I never thought this was possible. I thought I would spend my life alone, surviving but never truly living." Clara placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes what we need most comes from the most unexpected places." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, John felt a sense of peace he had not known in decades. The ranch, the land, the animals, and the women who had entered his life had created a balance that was steady and enduring. He realized that family could take many forms, and that love and companionship were not limited to the past or to old traditions. They could be built anew with care, patience, and mutual respect. And so, life on the ranch continued, richer and fuller than John could have imagined. The work remained demanding and challenges arose as they always would in the harsh desert. But John no longer faced them alone. He had companions, friends, and a newfound family. He had discovered that resilience was not only about enduring hardship, but about opening oneself to connection, trust, and shared purpose. The desert around them remained vast and unyielding, but within the boundaries of the ranch there was warmth, laughter, and the quiet certainty that life, even after loss, could offer second chances. John Miller, once a man resigned to loneliness, had found a family in the most unexpected of ways, and for the first time in many years, he looked toward the future not with fear or resignation, but with hope, knowing that the bonds formed here would sustain him through whatever challenges lay ahead. The ranch had never been quieter, yet it had never felt more alive. John Miller had spent decades knowing only the rhythm of work and solitude, but now the sound of laughter, conversation, and the occasional song of the women filled the air, creating a harmony he had once thought impossible. The desert, with its endless stretches of sand, cacti, and distant mountains, had once felt vast and lonely, a reflection of his own heart. Now it seemed less intimidating, softened by the warmth that had entered his life. The four women had become inseparable parts of the ranch. Clara, with her steady wisdom, often guided John in long-term decisions, when to plant crops, how to manage the water supply, and even when to repair certain fences to prevent future trouble. Lila's gentle care extended to every living creature, from the horses to the youngest chickens, ensuring that each animal was healthy and content. May was tireless in her practical skills, fixing, building, and improving everything she could touch, while Anna quietly observed, noticing details and patterns that even John had missed, learning quickly and assisting wherever necessary. Together they created a balance that John had never known, a rhythm of life that was both productive and deeply satisfying. Mornings began earlier than ever. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when John and the women were already at work. They fed the cattle together, ensuring that each animal was accounted for and cared for. The chickens were released into the yard, and the goats were led to the grazing fields. As the work unfolded, conversation flowed naturally. They shared stories, joked, and occasionally sang, creating an atmosphere that was comforting, familiar, and full of warmth. John could feel a sense of purpose that went beyond the work itself. He was no longer just surviving, he was living, fully and meaningfully. One day, John noticed how much the ranch had changed, not just in efficiency, but in spirit. The fences were stronger, the barns cleaner, and the fields were lush with new growth. But more importantly, there was laughter. The kind of laughter that came without hesitation, the kind that filled the space with life rather than noise. John watched as the women worked together seamlessly, their movements coordinated and graceful, their faces lit with determination and joy, and he felt a quiet pride in being a part of it, in helping to create this sense of family and belonging. Evenings became a sacred time. After a day of work, the group would gather around the fire outside the barn. They shared meals that were simple but satisfying: vegetables, bread, roasted meat, and occasionally a treat when the ranch yielded more than enough. Conversation flowed easily, covering everything from past memories to hopes for the future. Sometimes they shared silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast desert sky. These moments were comforting, steadying, and full of an unspoken understanding. John had never imagined that life could feel so rich again after years of loss. It was during one of these evenings that John realized how much he had changed. The loneliness that had haunted him for so many years no longer had power over him. He felt a sense of connection, belonging, and joy that he had not known since his wife had passed. He found himself laughing freely at jokes, offering advice when asked, and even sharing small, personal stories that he had kept buried for years. The women had opened a space in his heart that he thought was closed forever, and he was grateful for it every day. The term husband, which they used with quiet affection, had grown into a symbol of trust, respect, and shared responsibility. It was not about ownership or ceremony, but about the deep bond that had developed between John and the women. They relied on one another, supported one another, and cared for each other in ways that transcended words. John found that he no longer feared attachment or loss because he had learned that life could bring love in unexpected forms, and that the heart could heal, even after great sorrow. Seasons passed, and with them the rhythms of the ranch became more refined. Spring brought fresh growth and new challenges. Fields had to be planted, water channels checked, and animals cared for through unpredictable weather. John and the women worked tirelessly, often side by side, their movements coordinated and efficient. The work was hard, but it was rewarding. Each success, whether it was a healthy crop or a repaired fence, was celebrated with small moments of joy and gratitude. Summer brought heat, dust, and long hours in the sun, but the group faced it together. They worked early in the morning and late in the evening, taking small breaks to rest and share food. The bond between John and the women grew stronger with each passing day. He learned to trust their judgment, to rely on their insights, and to appreciate the quiet ways they supported him. In turn, he offered guidance, shared knowledge, and provided protection, creating a relationship built on mutual respect and care. Autumn arrived with cooler air and the promise of harvest. The ranch had never been more productive. John marveled at how the land seemed to respond to the combined efforts of the group. Fields were full, the animals were thriving, and the ranch felt like a living, breathing entity rather than just a collection of buildings and fences. The work remained demanding, but the shared effort made it manageable. And more than that, it made it meaningful. John had discovered a new way of life, one filled with purpose, connection, and the quiet joy of shared responsibility. The women also found comfort in their new life. Clara, who had carried so much grief in her heart, found solace in the stability and order of the ranch. Lila discovered that caring for the animals and working with John offered her a sense of purpose that she had thought lost. May thrived in the practical challenges, building, repairing, and improving the property, while Anna's quiet wisdom helped the group anticipate problems before they arose. Each of them found fulfillment not just in survival, but in being part of a family that respected, valued, and relied on one another. John began to notice small, beautiful changes in himself. He laughed more freely, offered encouragement, and shared moments of vulnerability without fear. He found joy in teaching the women new skills, in learning from them, and in participating in the simple pleasures of daily life. The desert, which had once felt harsh and unforgiving, now seemed a partner rather than an obstacle, a place where life could flourish when nurtured with care, patience, and love. As winter approached, the ranch became a place of warmth and refuge. The wind howled across the plains, rattling windows and stirring dust, but inside the barn and the house, there was comfort. Fires were built, meals were shared, and stories were told. The women's laughter filled the rooms, and John felt a deep sense of contentment. He realized that life, even after loss and loneliness, could offer unexpected blessings. He had discovered not only companionship, but family, love, and the profound satisfaction of shared effort and care. The ranch became a model of harmony. Visitors from the nearby town occasionally stopped by, surprised to see a man once known for his solitude now surrounded by 4 women working together with joy and purpose. John had become a figure of quiet admiration, not because of wealth or status, but because of the life he had built, a life full of love, trust, and unity. People could see that the ranch was more than a workplace. It was a home, a family, and a place of hope. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, John and the women sat around the fire outside the barn. They shared stories of the past, dreams for the future, and quiet reflections on the life they had built together. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast and wild, but within the circle of firelight there was safety, warmth, and belonging. John looked at the women, their faces glowing in the fading light, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had entered his life when he thought it was too late, and they had transformed it in ways he could never have imagined. Clara spoke softly, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We have all found something here, John. We have found work, home, and each other. We have built a life together." John nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I never thought I would experience this again. I thought I would die in loneliness, but you 4 have shown me that life can surprise us, even after loss." Lila reached out and touched his hand gently. "We are family now," she said, "and family takes care of each other." John felt a warmth spread through his chest. The fear, the sorrow, the years of loneliness, they all felt distant now, replaced by something stronger and more enduring. He had learned that life's most valuable gifts often come when least expected, and that love could be rebuilt piece by piece with trust, care, and shared effort. As night fell, the stars glittered across the desert sky, and John realized that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The ranch, once a place of isolation and sorrow, had become a home filled with laughter, love, and hope. The 4 women who had called him husband had given him more than companionship. They had given him family, purpose, and the profound joy of connection. Life on the ranch continued, rich with routine, laughter, and shared responsibilities. John knew the challenges would come, as they always would, but he also knew that he no longer faced them alone. Together, they had built something lasting and beautiful, a life that honored the past, embraced the present, and looked forward to the future with hope. And in that vast, sun-beaten desert, John Miller finally understood that he had not only survived his years of loneliness, but that he had discovered the true meaning of home, family, and love.